A few years ago, if someone had told you that a brand like Audemars Piguet would collaborate with Swatch, you probably would have laughed because we're talking about one of the most exclusive, aspirational, and respected names in all of Swiss watchmaking. A brand associated with extreme luxury, handcrafted finishes, waiting lists, and watches that can cost more than a car. And now, that same brand has just launched a new watch in collaboration with Swatch. Yes, the brand of affordable, colorful timepieces that previously took the entire internet by storm with the Moon Swatch. However, on this particular occasion, they have truly pushed the boundaries even further, because they did not simply settle for producing a budget-friendly version of the Royal Oak. Instead, they have crafted something significantly more eccentric. A vibrant bioceramic pocket watch featuring a distinct pop aesthetic, which has nonetheless triggered enormous queues, rampant reselling, and absolute pandemonium in retail locations across the entire globe. There are over 200 people waiting in Tokyo, endless lines in Valencia, with people spending hours just to get their hands on a single piece. The real question is, are we looking at a genuine stroke of pure marketing genius? Or has Audemars Piguet just opened a dangerous new door for the world of modern luxury? Today, we're going to take a look at everything behind the new APX Swatch Royal Pop. And let me tell you, this goes way beyond just a watch. The most impossible collab. Ever since Omega and Swatch launched the Moon Swatch, the watch industry has changed completely, because up until that point, collaborations between luxury and accessibility practically didn't exist in this way. And many people in the watch world thought, okay, Omega can do it because it belongs to the Swatch Group. Then came Blancpain by Swatch, and the phenomenon continued to grow from there. But Audemars Piguet was different, because AP doesn't belong to the Swatch Group. It's not a brand that typically plays with these kinds of mass-market strategies, and furthermore, its image has always been tied to extreme exclusivity. For years, Audemars Piguet has been one of the hardest luxury brands to buy. Endless waiting lists, exclusive boutiques, limited production, VIP priority, and a booming gray market. Everything at AP revolves around one idea: scarcity. And that is precisely why no one expected something like this. But this is where a very important detail comes in. Luxury in 2026 doesn't work the same way it did 20 years ago. Today, brands don't just compete to sell watches. They compete for attention, for cultural relevance, for virality, and for a presence on social media. And Swatch grasped that truth long before anyone else, because while many brands remained obsessed with tradition, Swatch turned watchmaking into pop culture, and honestly, it has worked out incredibly well for them. So, what is the Royal Pop really, when you break it down? Now, what exactly is this APX Swatch collaboration? Because many people were expecting a cheap Royal Oak, and the reality of the situation is actually much weirder than that. The new Royal Pop isn't just your typical traditional Royal Oak. It is a pocket watch inspired by the historic Royal Oak and those classic Swatch Pops from the 80s. And that completely shifts the entire narrative because it doesn't attempt to replace a real Royal Oak. Instead, it strives to become a truly unique cultural object. The design retains many of AP's visual elements: the octagonal case, the visible screws, the aggressive lines, and that instantly recognizable aesthetic, but reinterpreted in a much more fun and experimental way. The materials also make it clear that this isn't trying to compete with high horology. Here we have bioceramic, extremely bold colors, and a much more artistic approach. And then there's the movement, because it uses a manual variant inspired by the System 51, a movement that truly represents the Swatch philosophy: automation, industrial production, simplicity, and accessibility. But here's something very interesting. Even though it is technically a pocket watch, a wide variety of retail stores and major brands are already beginning to release watch straps that have been specifically designed and adapted for this particular model. And that shows something very interesting. The community doesn't just want to use it as a pocket watch, they want to wear it on their wrist. In fact, there are already people modifying it, customizing it, and trying to turn it into a kind of alternative Royal Oak, much more accessible and fun. Honestly, that aligns quite perfectly with the core Swatch philosophy, because these collaborations work so effectively by generating a constant stream of conversation long after the initial launch. We see mods, new straps, endless customizations, viral TikToks, secondary market resales, and heated debates. The watch is no longer just a product, it becomes a phenomenon. And the funny thing is, Even though it's such a strange watch, they've managed to make people want it. And that's quite an achievement because selling luxury is relatively easy, but selling something weird and turning it into a global phenomenon? That's a different story. Total, absolute global chaos. And this is the point where the story starts to get truly interesting, because the very second that the launch was finally announced, the entire internet just completely exploded. In Tokyo, we saw massive, sprawling queues with over 200 people waiting in line. The exact same chaotic situation was unfolding in Valencia. And suddenly, we were witnessing scenes that were incredibly reminiscent of the Moon Swatch launch. People were camping out, there were endless lines, immediate reselling, and social media was completely flooded with videos. The most interesting thing is that many people who criticized the Moon Swatch were lining up anyway, because a very powerful psychological factor comes into play here. FOMO, the fear of missing out. Swatch has managed to turn watch launches into cultural events. They no longer just sell a product. They sell experience, hype, scarcity, and a sense of belonging. And honestly, very few brands know how to do that today, because while some firms launch incredible watches that go completely unnoticed, Swatch manages to get half the internet talking about a bioceramic pocket watch. That is nothing but pure marketing, and it doesn't cost them a single penny. Because every single TikTok, every video clip, every social media post, and every long queue automatically transforms into a massive global advertising campaign, which is the ultimate underlying goal for the Swatch brand. Now let's get to the most important question. Why exactly are they doing this? And the answer is almost certainly not just to sell a few more watches. The actual underlying goal is to completely dominate the conversation. Swatch understood something truly fundamental. New generations simply don't approach luxury in the same way they once did. In the past, people would dream of owning a Rolex 20 years down the road. Today, brands need to connect with Gen Y and Gen Z right here, right now. They need to be on TikTok, YouTube, and Instagram, as well as in memes and the wider pop culture landscape. AP understood something vital. If you don't evolve, you'll eventually disappear from the conversation. The problem with modern luxury is that many brands have become too distant for most people, creating a significant disconnect. With collaborations like these, they achieve the exact opposite. Young people who could never walk into an AP boutique are now talking about Audemars Piguet, and that is worth a lot of money. Does this really damage the reputation of Audemars Piguet? But naturally, this is where the big controversy starts to unfold, because there are so many people who are genuinely upset about this launch. And in all honesty, I can understand the perspectives of both sides. On one hand, some think this is brilliant because it keeps AP relevant, modern, and part of the global conversation. But on the other hand, others feel the brand is losing its exclusivity, that collaborating with Swatch cheapens the Audemars Piguet name. And this brings up a very interesting question. What is luxury really in 2026? Because for decades, luxury was based almost exclusively on scarcity, price, and limited access. But today, cultural relevance is just as important. Look at brands like Louis Vuitton, Gucci, or even Porsche. They've all understood that modern luxury needs to connect emotionally with new generations. And AP is probably trying to do exactly that. The question is, to what extent can you democratize a brand without destroying part of its magic? Because the danger we face is truly real, and the Moon Swatch has already demonstrated something quite important. The hype can be absolutely brutal, but it can also eventually become completely saturated. In my personal opinion, I think this is a marketing masterstroke, not necessarily as a watch, not necessarily as a piece of high-end watchmaking, but certainly as a cultural phenomenon, because they've achieved something very difficult. Getting people who would normally never talk about Audemars Piguet to talk about Audemars Piguet. And in 2026, that's worth its weight in gold. That said, I also perfectly understand those who feel that these types of collaborations can erode exclusivity. And honestly, I think part of that is true, because even though these collaborations generate massive visibility, they also strip away some of the prestige that an ultra-luxury brand like AP had been building for decades. Because part of the allure of brands like AP has always been that very sense of inaccessibility, that idea that this isn't for everyone. And when you start seeing the Audemars Piguet logo on mass market, colorful, viral, and relatively accessible products, it's inevitable that some of that exclusive aura gets diluted. In fact, that is precisely the great risk of these types of collaborations. You gain relevance, you gain attention, you gain cultural presence, but at the same time, you can lose part of that mystery and prestige that made the brand special. Because luxury relies heavily on perception, and the more accessible something seems, the less inaccessible it feels. But perhaps true modern luxury is no longer just about being inaccessible. Perhaps true modern luxury is remaining relevant. And like it or not, everyone is talking about Audemars Piguet today. And that's no coincidence. But now I want to hear your take. Do you think AP by Swatch is a stroke of genius? Or do you think these types of collaborations damage the image of luxury? Would you buy one, or would you never pay for something like that? I'll be reading every single one of your comments, and if you enjoy these types of videos about watchmaking, luxury, the market, and controversies, make sure to subscribe, because there are some great videos coming to the channel. See you in the next video.